Ethnic Chinese make up about 75% of Singapore's population, constituting the largest ethnic group in the multiracial country that also includes Malays and Indians. And over the past decade, Beijing has stepped up its efforts to reach out to Chinese Singaporeans in a way that has drawn concern from the city-state's political establishment. Notably, the Chinese Communist Party has sought to build relationships with Singaporean media, giving journalists special access in return for favorable coverage. You may remember the disappearance of Chinese tennis star Peng Shuai. She had accused a senior official in China of sexual assault. As global concern about her well-being grew, Peng briefly reappeared speaking to Singaporean newspaper Lianhe Zaobao. Joining us is Shabani Mahtani of The Washington Post. She published a major investigation examining the relationship between China and Singapore, and she is also co-author of an upcoming book, Among the Braves: Hope, Struggle, and Exile in the Battle for Hong Kong and the Future of Global Democracy, written along with Timothy McLaughlin. Shabani, let's look a bit more at media. We mentioned the newspaper Lianhe Zaobao. How does its coverage appear to reflect Beijing's point of view?
Yeah, so to do this investigation, we basically compiled about 800 articles from Zaobao. And, what we wanted to do was a very forensic examination of their coverage. And so we divided this by categories, topics that would be sensitive to China, or topics that, Beijing has sought to kind of control the narrative. For example, the ongoing human rights abuses in Xinjiang, Hong Kong, and the pro-democracy, movement there, Taiwan. And basically on all of these sensitive topics, we found that Zaobao was actually, more using mainland sources, so CCP official sources. They were using pro-Beijing media and really not offering that much of a counterbalance or counterpoint on these sensitive topics. And alongside that, we also found that their opinion section actually had a number of CCP, party officials involved in actually propaganda writing these op-eds, but they were not really identified as such, just simply identified as China affairs commentators.
And so what impact does something like that have on ethnic Chinese in Singapore?
Yeah, so, the one really interesting thing that's been happening in recent years is that the ethnic Chinese population in Singapore, especially certain parts of it, older people specifically, have become more and more sort of overtly pro-Beijing in their views. People have been posting on Reddit, Singapore, which is a very vibrant forum, saying that their parents have sort of been radicalized. I grew up in Singapore, so I've had friends tell me that their parents, were pretty kind of like neutral, apolitical, and suddenly have become very, very stridently pro-Beijing. And, that was seen during COVID, where some of them were even so extreme that they only wanted to take Sinovac, even though the Singapore government was really advising to take, Pfizer or Moderna, right, the mRNA vaccines. And so, looking at this whole media landscape, we're very interested to figure out like where a lot of this radicalization was coming from. A lot of it comes from, forwarded WhatsApp messages, from TV and so on. But Zaobao is like a very trusted newspaper here, a flagship broadsheet paper. The narratives were only being sort of backed up or sort of hardened by the coverage in Zaobao, right? They weren't offering any kind of alternate view. They weren't offering a sort of counterbalance or counterpoint, and then that's what our investigation found.
So how is this playing out politically? Are Singaporean officials worried?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a really, really interesting question. I think Singapore has for so long had this policy of kind of neutrality. Please don't make us take sides. We have this very strong defense relationship with the U.S., but we also have this very strong, economic relationship and obvious cultural ties with China. And I think for so long, Singapore has also, had to manage the fact that it is a majority ethnic Chinese state within a very diverse Southeast Asia, right? I mean, indeed, the whole founding story of Singapore was that of multi-ethnic, multiculturalism over sort of, being, prioritizing any one sort of ethnic group. So I think the Singapore government has sort of had to be very careful in dealing with this. They don't seem to want to kind of upset bilateral relationships with China, but at the same point, I think they realize that, you know, if too many Singaporeans are really starting to subscribe to this narrative of this sort of, you know, China dream as sort of promoted by Xi Jinping, like that has a very sort of Han ethnic Chinese sort of bent to it, then I think they realize that the fabric of Singapore itself could really be threatened, right? But you know, it's been interesting to see how they've had to kind of toe the line between that, right? Not upsetting China, but also not letting this get out of hand locally.
Looking at Southeast Asia, is Beijing's focus on Singapore any different than its activities elsewhere in the region?
Actually, the interesting thing is that we found that, you know, Singapore was not really an isolated case here. I think, you know, in Malaysia, where the ethnic Chinese population have had, you know, historical and long-term sort of grievances there because of, you know, very ethnic policies that the state has, you see more and more ethnic Chinese also kind of subscribing or becoming, you know, very, very pro-Beijing in their viewpoint, in their worldview. And that is also true in pockets of Indonesia, Thailand too. The Philippines we didn't look at as closely, but it is a regional story, right? I mean, China being the biggest neighbor here, U.S.-China being sort of the defining issue, you know, of our time. It has really polarized a big part of society, right? I mean, equally, you have people becoming more and more stridently pro-U.S. actually, and so I think this polarization, right, it has to be something that is very carefully managed by governments all across the region, but especially when it comes to the ethnic Chinese community, just because their presence is so large, right? Southeast Asia is home to 80% of ethnic Chinese outside of mainland China, Taiwan, Hong Kong.
Shabani Mahtani, thank you so much for joining us.